All right, I think we're about ready to get started. So first of all, thank you to everyone who's joining us today. People are still hopping on the Zoom. And thank you to Peggy Grande, who's here today. And I'm going to do a quick intro and we'll then get started. But first, I want to just say is, I think my question has been, and the question has been from students is, have you ever wondered what it's been like or what it's like to work for the President of the United States? Today, we have an exciting PCOM guest speaker. Yes, I'm so excited. Peggy Grande, the executive assistant to President Ronald Reagan from 1989 to 1999, and also the author of The President Will See You Now is here. So we've got a jam-packed agenda today, which I put together. And if I can get to it, we'll share it. There we go. So I quickly put this together. I have a feeling we're not going to get to all of it today. Even from some of the questions to my class, what are the questions like? Are they about entrepreneurship, managing complex organizations? What do they really focus on? Take a look at your questions, guys. Probably more personal, right? So I have a feeling that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about. So I'll give a quick introduction to Peggy. We'll talk about effective communication, managing complex operations, building strong relationships, because that's one of the things I can't wait for Peggy to talk about. We've also got navigating political and social issues and entrepreneurship, which is very much what Peggy is doing today. So you can see I put time periods here. I doubt we'll get to all of that. So let's move on to Peggy's background. And first things first, you know that she has been the executive assistant, or she was the executive assistant to President Ronald Reagan for 10 years. And she's the author of the book, The President Will See You Now, My Stories and Lessons from Ronald Reagan's Final Years. Now, she's also a keynote speaker, TV and radio commentator. How cool is that? What questions do you have about that? Do you guys have a question? Yes. So Peggy, we're going to get started in a second, but how did you get invested in that career?
I think it found me instead of me finding it. I was very reluctant to ever get in front of the camera. But I think with my time with President Reagan, it just turned out that I knew I had a very unique story to tell, and I was the only person who could tell it. And so I had to just overcome my fears and be a good steward of the opportunity I had been given and step up and do it. And it's terrifying. I now do a weekly television program in Australia. I just finished a podcast with a group, and so I do a lot in the media space, which I never thought I would do. But sometimes life finds you instead of you finding it, and I just said yes. And as much as it still is terrifying, especially to do live television, it's something that you can get the hang of and get better at all the time and prepare better for, so that you feel more comfortable and confident.
Now, more in your bio, you were chair of World for Brexit and was national spokesperson for a California ballot initiative, which we also have questions about. But what's so interesting to me is that you've continued with not just politics, but also nonprofit things that you've done. But more recently, you've served as presidential appointee during the Trump administration. And I love where it says you consider it the honor of a lifetime to have worked for 2 presidents of the United States in both support and strategic roles. You also serve on the board of Pepperdine University School of Public Policy and the board of the Center for American Ideas. And I know that you are a mother of 4. I don't know how you do it all. A little quick background of how Peggy joined us today is several years ago when her book came out. I believe it was 2017, 2018 that you were on C-SPAN. And my husband had watched you on C-SPAN. You were talking about your book at the Presidential Library. And I remember him saying to me, you got to come watch this. You got to come watch this. And immediately after that, my husband reached out to Peggy. And I don't remember what the correspondence was, but you were kind enough to send him a signed copy of your book, which was just so cool. And both of us were looking through the book. He read it immediately. And it wasn't until recently that I got a chance to read the whole thing, which is why I have lots of questions today. So with that and my quick little introduction to your bio, one of the things we'd like to do is talk a little bit about, and I can jump back to the agenda if that's easier, or just kind of bring you up on the screen so everybody can see you. So I'm going to stop my share so we can actually see you today. Hello, hello.
Hello. Hello to everybody who's online and in the classroom. And thank you, Jennifer, for welcoming me to your class. I know as a teacher, it's not something you take lightly, turning over a few minutes of your time of your class to me. And so I want to be a good steward of that. You only had about 3,000 questions, so I guarantee we won't get through all of those today. But we'll try to touch on at least the essence of everything that you wanted to know, and hopefully give your students a better idea of what life in the communications space outside of the university could potentially look like.
That would be fantastic. I think the first section just of the agenda is talking about your experiences. And I think the question on the minds of most students is, how'd you get the position? Because it's such a coveted position and such an amazing opportunity. And as I've said to students, I said, this is one of the coolest jobs you'll ever have, because not only do you meet famous people and you're privy to all of the interworkings of the government, but it sets you up for the rest of your career with all of the things that you've learned, all of the people that you've met. So we were so curious, how did you get the job?
Well, I'll back up and start a little bit about myself and my background and how I got to that place. And I apologize right now, I'm a little bit hoarse. I finished an hour-long podcast, and you would think as a speaker, my voice would be my strong suit, but it's really my Achilles heel. So I've got hot tea at the ready. I apologize if I have to cough, but I'm a little raspy sounding today on my second hour of talking. I don't know how you teachers do it. But I was born and raised in Southern California. I was kind of a nerdy little kid who loved presidents and politics and government. I didn't know anybody who was connected to that world. My family wasn't a donor class. My family, actually, I come from a family of educators, but it was just a little hobby and an interest of mine. I read every book I could possibly get my hands on about presidents and first ladies and the White House and government. And so while other kids were learning about animals or trucks or trains, I was learning about presidents. So I think it was a little bit of destiny. My dad raised me to believe that somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. So fast forward to, I'm in college. I don't study political communication. I don't study politics at all, political science, because what are the chances, especially a woman back then, would ever go into the political arena? But I study communications when I do a minor in business, and I think that that will set me up for anything and everything, even though I definitely don't know what that thing will be. I didn't do journalism, even though I thought about it, because I thought, oh God, I'd be terrified to ever be in front of the camera. So I don't want to even step near that. So I was an organizational communications major, minor in business at Pepperdine University there in just outside of Los Angeles, but kept my eye on politics still as a sideline. Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and in him I found so many things that I loved. Of course, he was a great communicator. He was known as the great communicator. So I followed his speeches. I wrote about them. I dissected them for all my comms classes. And in fact, I think my professors finally said, you have to study somebody besides Ronald Reagan to do your papers, because we've seen and read enough about your affection for the way he writes and communicates. But I went through my course of study there. I had one semester left. I wanted to do an internship. Ronald Reagan had just left the White House and had come back to Los Angeles to open his post-presidency office. And I thought of my dad's words, you know, somebody has to have the job you want, it might as well be you. I thought if I could work any place in Los Angeles, it would be for that man. But what are the chances that would ever happen, right? Well, I took a chance and I wrote a letter, probably on my old typewriter, licked a stamp, licked an envelope, very old school, mailed it off, never expected I would even hear from them. So you can imagine my surprise one day standing in my dorm room when the phone rings and it's the office of Ronald Reagan calling, inviting me in for an interview. I am terrified, but also very excited. I was working my way through college at Nordstrom, so I knew what I would wear, wardrobe check. Everything else was the complete Wild West of unknown. But I went to the interview. I thought it actually went pretty well. And as I left the interview, I was sitting in the front office lobby area, waiting for the woman to validate my parking. Kind of doing that exhale that you have after an interview, after something really tense, thinking that the pressure was off. All of a sudden, I look across the lobby, and here walking right toward me is Ronald Reagan. And I panic. I don't know what to do. I never prepared myself for what I would do if I met him. I don't know why it never dawned on me that Ronald Reagan might actually work in the office of Ronald Reagan, but I hadn't prepared myself. So I panicked, and I thought about what I would do if the flag was passing by. So I stood up and I put my hand over my heart and didn't even look at him, just kind of stared off into the distance non-threateningly. Well, Ronald Reagan walked right up to me, shook my hand. He didn't need an introduction, but I introduced myself to him. And it was this magical moment looking into those eyes for the very first time, thinking it probably would be the last time I ever looked into those eyes. And as much as I felt like I had made a fool of myself during that moment, it was such a cherished, special moment. And I thought about it so many times over the course of the next 10 years when I watched other people have their magic first meeting with Ronald Reagan and had a chance to look him in the eye and meet him for the first time. You know, I had imagined him as this 10-foot tall giant. He had been an actor, a celebrity, a governor of California, president of the United States. But when it came down to it, he was an ordinary man, 6 feet tall, looking me in the eye. So what a magical moment. From there, I was hired for what I thought would be a short-term internship as I finished college. I graduated. The woman who hired me actually returned to Washington, D.C. They asked me to take that job. And so I started as the executive assistant to the chief of staff and served in that role for a year or two. And then Ronald Reagan's longtime executive assistant he had had since before he was governor retired, and they asked me to take that job. So you don't say no to a job opportunity like that, but I was 6 months pregnant with my first baby. I wasn't quite sure how I would navigate all of that. But over the course of the next 10 years, I had the opportunity to get to know Ronald Reagan as a person, not just a president, to sit outside his office door every day, interface between him, his staff, and the world, and consider myself the luckiest woman in the world for having that opportunity to do so. So from 1989 to 1999, I served in his post-presidency office. After that, he left the public eye, and I returned home full-time as a mom of 3, eventually of 4 children, for a short period of time. And 5 years later, we lost Ronald Reagan, but he belongs to the ages now. Mrs. Reagan lived several years longer, and I had the opportunity to continue to be involved with her in legacy building projects for Ronald Reagan and continued that connection with the Reagans. So really 27 years of my life from when I was in my early 20s all the way through adulthood was really interwoven with these incredible people, Ronald and Nancy Reagan. So I'll leave it there, throw it back to Jennifer and see where she wants to go now.
Perfect. It's such an amazing story because again, that one position has led to so many different opportunities for you. And I think one of the main questions students had as well is you were privy to the internal workings of, the leader of the free world. So what are the key lessons or takeaways? And these could be communication or otherwise that you would share, what you've shared with your own kids and the students here today.
Yeah, in so many ways, obviously it was different. We dealt with security, United States Secret Service. There was no organic movements. You didn't change your mind and go someplace at the last minute. There was no spontaneity at all. Obviously, we dealt with very high level individuals, world leaders, but in a lot of ways, it was just the same as any office, whether it's a business, a nonprofit, a political organization, a startup. A lot of the techniques and the mechanics of it were exactly the same, just maybe the stakes were a little bit higher. Certainly, we wanted him to be safe in everything, but he had established this amazing legacy that people had followed and watched all around the world. And so as somebody who worked for him, I definitely felt the stress and the pressure of wanting to live up to that legacy, never wanting to do or say or print anything that would embarrass him. And so I think that even though there were a lot of similarities, there definitely were some things that were different. He never put the pressure on me. I put it on myself. But I'd say, after looking back at 10 years working for him, there's a couple of things that really stood out to me. You know, you think of diplomacy as something being very high level, and I know we're going to talk a lot about relationships further, but when it comes down to it, it was just relationships, and it was relationships with some incredible people from around the world, but it wasn't just rhetoric, it was realistic and it was connected. And that's why communication is so important. I guess one of the other things I learned in watching him, I was very young, not much older, probably than most of your students, maybe even their same age, when I stepped into a place like this. And I guess I originally thought that there was one of two paths in life and you had to choose. You could be either strong and successful, or you could be a kind, good person. But I didn't know that you could actually choose to be both. And so in Ronald Reagan, I found somebody who obviously was strong and successful. He had stood on the world stage. He had gone toe to toe with the Soviet Union and the wall had come down. But behind that, there was this humanity, there was this kindness, this charisma, this approachability and transparency. There was an authenticity to who he was and what he was that really resonated, and that I think made his communication that much more relatable to people and acceptable. People wanted to listen to him because they thought that he knew them or understood him or kept them in mind when he was creating his messaging. He also was a great optimist, and I think optimism goes such a long way in the way that we message. Are we a magnet that draws people to us, or are we full of negativity and toxicity that drives people away or divides people? But he had such a great way of being an optimist. And even though he didn't, I think, live his life with his legacy in mind, I think it's important for all of us to think about our legacy as we build our careers, as we establish relationships, as we choose the messaging that we use, because it's really, we're building our legacy. And so we should lead and we should live as if our legacy depends upon it, because it really does. And so I would say some of those are the big takeaways. Communication in general, I actually wrote down a couple of things I wanted to share, because I think there's some key elements of what works in communication. So Jennifer, if you're fine, I can just roll straight into that, if that works for you.
Perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah. So I talked about positive language, and there was some techniques he used. He would always use the positive version of language instead of the negative. He would say things like he would say things like always remember instead of never forget, or I am pleased to do something instead of I do not want to do something. And so there's usually a positive way to say something. We have to keep in mind, he was an actor, he was a storyteller, and people sometimes made fun of him for that. They'd say, oh, I don't know how you could be president and be an actor. And he'd say, I don't know how you could be president without being an actor. Not that he was putting on airs, but you had to know the camera, you had to know how to communicate, you had to know the beauty of timing, and you had to know your audience. And we saw that, I think, culminate beautifully in the Challenger speech. And, you know, I remember watching this as a young person in high school when the Challenger exploded, and President Reagan came on air that night and met a grieving nation from the Oval Office and came right into our living rooms and shared his heart. And in essence, he joined us in our grief, in this tragic loss. And we expect our leaders to do that. We've seen so much tragedy recently in our nation, and we want our leaders to meet us where we are, to join us in that sense of grief and loss. And Reagan did that beautifully. And for anybody who hasn't watched that speech, I encourage you to go back and watch it, the Challenger speech. It beautifully expressed what we were feeling, but also pivoted to a positive message, you know, that the space program would continue. We would honor these people's memories by continuing with their life's work. And it was such an important moment for our nation, but the president communicated in such a beautiful way. Some of the things that I think are important when you're crafting a message of your own that I've found are things that work. You have to establish credibility first and foremost. So Jennifer could have come on and said, hey, I want you guys to meet my friend Peggy. She's got 4 kids, she's got 2 grandkids, and I think she's a great communicator. Well, that probably wouldn't have resonated as well as saying, here's Peggy's credentials. Here's how Jennifer, established credibility of who I am, because that then determines why you should bother listening to me at all. So establishing credibility in why they should listen to you or why they should listen to a speaker that you're bringing is really important. And then building connection, knowing who your audience is, knowing where they're at in life, what they're thinking, how they're feeling, where they're coming from. Building connection is really important. It's an essential part of people being willing to listen to what you have to say. You need to speak to them in a way that's not above them or beneath them, but really is more speaking with them. Reagan did this so beautifully. He always made sure he addressed them where they were at. I always think about when I'm communicating, why should people care what I say? What does it have to do with them? How will they benefit from what I have to say? And then, especially in the political realm, what's the call to action? Because a lot of times it's one thing to lay out reasons or rationale behind things, but it's another thing. So what do you want me to do about that? What is the call to action? And I think it's important to express all of those things. Again, I talk a lot about the political arena because that's where I come from, but I think that the political arena really filters over into everything we do. If you can communicate and persuade in the political arena, you can probably do so anywhere. And we see two different aspects of political communication. We sometimes see people go to the emotional side. Sometimes it's what the left does better. And I'm not going to talk politics. I'm just going to kind of dissect how political communications happens. Sometimes we look at people on the right and they try to persuade with facts and figures. And typically we know what persuades more, don't we? It's the emotion, it's the storytelling, it's telling a story or bringing up a person who has experienced something that really tugs at the heartstrings, that brings you to a place of change. Ronald Reagan, I think, did this really beautifully because he took the facts and the figures. He was willing to be the adult in the room and say, basically, okay, America, we're going to have a hard conversation about taxes or about, stepping up with innovation and entrepreneurialism. We need everybody to be part of changing and pivoting America in a better direction. But he usually did it in the way of storytelling, as only an actor can do. I think back to his first days in office. And if you look at the 1970s, it was characterized as a period of malaise. And under Jimmy Carter, taxes were high, inflation was high, unemployment was high, and worst of all, American morale was incredibly low. Ronald Reagan came in and on day one, changed the narrative by the way he communicated with America. He said, it's morning in America. There's a shining city on the hill and we all get to be part of it. America's best days are ahead. And people listened to that and they wanted to be part of that and they were challenged to participate in that. And really day one in Reagan's presidency, America was exactly the same. But the narrative had changed. The way he communicated to America had changed, and it made people want to invent, create, invest, innovate once again. And when you ask Ronald Reagan at the end of his 8 years what he was most proud of, he didn't say it was any policy or anything he had specifically done. He said, I made the American people believe in themselves again. And so for you, as you step into positions of leadership, as you continue to communicate, it's not really about what you're saying. It's about being heard and what that causes in your audience. Does it cause them to change their mind? Does it cause them to change an opinion or believe what you're saying? Does it cause them to take action? And so really that's the essence of communication, not one way, but really evoking a response in your audience. And Ronald Reagan did that so well. A lot of times communicators, especially on the right, we think, oh, people don't cover what we say. There's this bias in the media. And I always look at myself and say, do I give them something worth covering? Am I giving them a hook that's interesting? Am I giving them an angle that's unique? Am I giving something that is worth talking about? And if I'm not, then that's on me as much as it is on them. And so it's easy sometimes to blame that we don't get the coverage we want, but are we really putting in the hard work? Are we thinking about the messages that we're conveying and putting creativity into them so that there's something that people want to listen to, they want to take action on, and they want to cover? You know, some of the other things to think about when you're communicating, especially if you're doing it in the media space or you want to gain attention for your story, there's natural waves and timing for everything. And so, of course, around 4th of July, people will look for patriotic messaging. Around tax day, people will be talking about how taxes are too high or how government doesn't spend them the way we want it. And so I can encourage you to look at what's coming on the horizon that you want to be talking about, that you can insert yourself now into those conversations. You can anticipate that around Labor Day, they're going to be having the right to work arguments and things like that. And so what are the topics that have natural waves, that have timing associated with them, that if you want to be an effective communicator, you can step into that space and communicate well with them? And a lot of you, some of you may be looking at graduating soon, going into the job market. I would encourage you to become the best version of yourself as a communicator. You know, I shied away from being in front of the camera because when I looked at great communicators like Ronald Reagan, or you look at, you know, these people that go viral and have millions of people who follow them, or, you know, Tony Robbins, or people like that who just have such a cult following for being great communicators. I looked at myself in the mirror and I thought, I'll never be that. I can't be that. And maybe that's not my style and I don't even want to be that. But my challenge to myself and my challenge to you is, can you consistently be a better version of yourself? And every time I speak, every time I do media, as painful as it is, I always go back, I watch it, I listen to it, because I realize things about myself that I want to change, you know, and I try to do it in a positive way, not beating myself up. But I realized early on, you know, I talked too much with hands flying into the screen on TV, or I talked too much with my eyebrows moving, or I bounced around the set too much. And so there are things you can learn by listening and watching yourself, that I constantly strive to be the better version of myself, and hopefully the best version of myself. And so you don't have to be the best version of anybody else. And coming on the heels of learning from the great communicator himself, it's really hard to compare yourself to him, and I don't and try not to. But can I be the best version of myself? And so that's what I challenge each one of you to do as you endeavor into your own communications journey, whatever that looks like. And that's kind of, you know, spoken communication. I also want to highlight real quickly the power of the pen and written communication. And yes, emails are important. I am on email all the time, as Jennifer knows. We've gone back and forth several times. But I will challenge you to go old school. Power of the pen. Ronald Reagan used to write handwritten notes all the time. I write handwritten notes all the time. And I go to big fancy black tie dinners often. Sometimes I'll be seated between a governor and a senator or a congressman. And inevitably I get home, I write little notes to them telling them it was nice to meet them. I send them out. And by the time that I'm sure those have landed on their desks, I've received messages from both of them in writing, old school, handwritten. This is something that people do that are at the top of their game. If you want to make a difference, if you don't want to be deleted by like spam on an email, send handwritten notes. I actually heard the president and CEO of Walmart speak recently. I sent him a copy of my book along with a handwritten note, thanking him for his message and sharing a copy of my book and my background with him. I got a handwritten note back from Doug McMillon, the president and CEO of Walmart, basically thanking me for the book. And he said, congratulations on living a life of consequence. This is a man who has probably over 2 million employees worldwide and took time to write a handwritten note. And I know when he was writing that note, he couldn't have been doing anything else except thinking about that. This is something that people at the top of their game do. This isn't old school. This isn't outdated. And if it's not in your portfolio of communication, I want to challenge you to do that and learn to do it well. I have little tiny note cards. I can jot one out in about a minute. but I know that people enjoy receiving them. You may not even remember the last time you got a handwritten note, but if you do remember it, you'll probably remember who it's from. So don't be like spam and only do email that can be deleted. Take the time, write a note, and make an impact in a way that most people aren't doing these days. So I'll come up for air. I'll take some hot tea, see where Jennifer wants to go next.
Peggy, that's a lot to unpack. We really
I told you it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose today, but hopefully there's little nuggets that people will
the
get.
handwritten notes I absolutely love. And that's always a question I have when we do thank you notes, for whether it be after job interviews, or we haven't talked as much about it in this class because we were talking about other types of writing. But that is that's fantastic advice, because at the end of the day, you do remember those people that write handwritten notes to you.
Yeah.
And again, they're not going to delete it, especially if it's spam
Right.
or just an email, because people are so busy. So I absolutely love that. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were saying that, part of your job was constantly communicating. Now, we didn't have email. So were you always were you constantly at the typewriter? What were some of the tasks that you did on a daily basis where you were communicating?
Yeah, a lot of it was by telephone, old school. Remember that? You'd pick up the phone and talk to people. I did a lot of that. But again, I knew that I was, in essence, the face and the voice of Ronald Reagan. And for every 100 people that wanted to talk to or come visit Ronald Reagan, 99 of them probably got me instead. So I know that was a huge disappointment to them, but could I, in my communication and my interaction with them, give them just a feel or a taste of Ronald Reagan? How would he have spoken to them? How would he have treated them? How would he have listened to them or acknowledged them if he had had the chance to do that personally? And so that was a role and responsibility I didn't take lightly, because I knew that people, even if they got that phone call from the office of Ronald Reagan like I had in my dorm room, that might be the most exciting moment of their day or their year or their life. And so I wanted to not belittle that moment and to take it seriously and to realize that I was communicating on behalf of the great communicator. And so I wanted to get it right. I wanted to do it well. I did not want to have any errors ever. So I would read, reread, set things aside, come back to it with fresh eyes before I would send it out. But yeah, we did a lot of personal communication, a lot, obviously, of drafted letters for him that he would sign. He also did a lot of his own correspondence. Often he would come out with a handwritten letter on his, beautiful gold embossed Ronald Reagan letterhead. And he would have this long handwritten letter written out. He'd bring it to me and he'd say, "Peggy, could you type this up and send this out?" And I'd say, "Mr. President, I will respectfully decline and say, I think they'd rather have the handwritten version." So I would make a copy for the file, but send that beautifully handwritten letter that had come straight from his pen and straight from his heart to that person, expressing exactly what he wanted to say, how he wanted to say it. And so a lot of my work was communication, and really a lot of everybody's work comes down to communication, whether you work for a nonprofit, for a government agency, for business, whether you run your own shop and hang your own shingle. It all comes down to communication. And one of the things that I would say that made it easy, I guess, or easier to communicate on behalf of Ronald Reagan is he was very clear in his communication style. I already talked about it being very positive, but there were themes that he stuck to regularly. And so as long as you were incorporating those themes into the drafts that you would send him to look at, you'd probably get it right. And so he was all about optimism, about individual freedom, about liberty. And so those were themes, patriotism, that you couldn't go wrong with if the letters and the writing was infused with those. And so I think when you're working for a boss or you are the boss, to have clarity of what's important to you, what you value, that helped those of us around Ronald Reagan know exactly what he would say if he were saying it himself. And so that helped our team as well. We were almost always on the same page because we knew what the boss wanted, we knew what he expected, we knew how he would do it and say it. And so it was much easier to deliver on that regularly.
I mean, it sounds like he was an amazing boss to work for. So
He
one of the
was. He
questions,
completely spoiled me. I was in my 20s and I said, I've had the best job I will ever have. How do you ever top this?
which I'll pull up the pictures momentarily, but one of the
Yeah,
questions
please
that
do.
students had was, what was the challenging aspect of your job? Was it ever that, did you ever have to have a difficult conversation with President Reagan about an issue or even a, some encounter or experience?
Yeah. Well, and Jennifer, you know, if you've read my book, I actually write about just a really difficult period in that role. Ronald Reagan comes out and he announces 5 years into his post-presidency that he has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which I'm sure now all your students know all about. But at the time, there was no information on it. I went to the library. I found one book that was kind of about old age or senility. Now, of course, you can Google and more information comes up than you ever want to know. But 5 years into my time with him, he announces to the world that he has Alzheimer's disease. We don't know much about it. I certainly don't know what that's going to mean for him, for me, for the office, but we took our cues and clues from Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Reagan as well. And they were so bold and transparent about sharing that journey with the American people. And we decided to journey through it together. And rather than taking that as a death sentence, he took it as the diagnosis that it was. And he really chose to live life as best as he could, as long as he could. And so 5 years into his post-presidency, the world starts saying goodbye to him because they think he's gonna die any moment. But he continues to come to the office and I say good morning to him every day for the next 5 years. And so those 5 years, there was a lot of change in the way we did things and in our work, but he continued to soldier on as best as he could, as long as he could, which I really appreciated. So 10 years then into serving him as his executive assistant, he moves home full time, no longer comes to the office, but I continue to visit with him there at his home. I write about some of those very personal, private visits with him up at his home during the last 5 years of his life. And so 15 years after he leaves the White House, he leaves the earth and says goodbye to us. But really, there was 10 very productive, active years in there. And that's really the essence of my book. To tell the part when he leaves the White House, he comes back to Los Angeles. People know he got Alzheimer's and died, but there was 15 years in there. And so that was really the heart of my book, to talk about him, the character of the man, not in a political way, but just as a person. It's a character sketch of a man I got to know and care about very deeply and serve, that great patriot for all those years.
Which one of the questions I also have concerns that time period. And some of the students were wondering, how was it working? Obviously, you had to work very closely with Nancy Reagan during this time period to communicate the messages that you wanted to communicate. So first of all, as you found out this information, what was the effect and how did you work together with them in terms of communicating to the public?
Yeah. Yeah, obviously the office work changed a little bit. His travel schedule slowed. Anybody who's ever worked with somebody, even who's just aging, you know, the pace of play sometimes changes. And so it certainly did for us. And we took our cues and from him, how he was feeling, how he was doing that day, what kind of energy he had. But yeah, Mrs. Reagan and I started to work much closer together, just making sure that I was communicating how he was doing in the office, how things were going. She was communicating about how things had gone in the morning or in the evening, just so that we were on the same page. And what a wonderful person Mrs. Reagan was. You can imagine, as a young woman working for her husband, you know, people have said, how did that go? But we had a great mutual understanding and trust. I think she knew that I was loyal to her and to him. I just wanted for his legacy to be served as best as possible. We communicated openly, which was so important. And especially in those later years, it became even more important to communicate clearly. Even writing about the Alzheimer's, I wasn't quite sure if that was appropriate to do so, but it was something that the Reagans wanted to share with the American people and the world. They knew that by them disclosing this, that a lot of research dollars and interest would go to Alzheimer's, and it has. Like I said, there's so many resources available now that weren't available before. And so I felt like, since it was something that they were comfortable talking about, that it was something that I could talk about as well. I write a funny story in my book about Mrs. Reagan, and I'm sure, Jennifer, you remember it, but we used to communicate about a lot of things, and it wasn't always something serious. And in fact, the president walked into the office one day and he was wearing like his kind of like a Mr. Rogers kind of cardigan sweater, and it was the color of orange sherbet ice cream. And he was going to play golf that day, which was fine, but we had added an appointment on his schedule earlier in the day. And so here he was, President Orange Sherbet, wearing this sweater, and I was kind of mortified that he had an appointment coming in, but it was what it was, and that was how the day was going to go. So the man came in, they took their pictures, it was a lovely meeting. The gentleman left, the president left to play golf, and I picked up the phone and I called Mrs. Reagan and I said, Mrs. Reagan, this is Peggy. And I said, did you see your husband before he left the house this morning? And she said, no, why? And I said, when he gets home from golf, you will know why. And she said, oh, do I need to make something disappear? And I said, I think you do, and you won't have any trouble knowing which item of clothing I'm talking about. So later that afternoon, my phone rings in my desk and it's Mrs. Reagan, and she says, Peggy, it's done. Like she had just, done this covert operation. And so I don't know who in Los Angeles wound up with an orange sherbet colored sweater at, Goodwill or Salvation Army. But Mrs. Reagan made sure that he never showed up in the office again wearing that sweater.
That sounds like an amazing memory. One of the questions also is, what's your favorite memory of working with the Reagans?
Oh, I mean, there's so many. And as you know, if you go through my book, pictures of all the world leaders who came in. I mean, these iconic people that now belong to the ages, like Gorbachev and Mother Teresa and Margaret Thatcher and Prime Minister Mulroney and Helmut Kohl and Prime Minister Nakasone and all kings and queens and princes and princesses. And I mean, just an incredible lineup of people, along with every former president and first lady. Just the opportunity to meet all of them in person was unbelievable pinch me moments. I see that you put up a picture. This is in President Reagan's former president's office in Los Angeles. And so you can see how beautiful it was, how it was elegant, and it had a formality to it, but also a warm welcome, very Western leaning. Those are bronze saddles that he had on display, and a beautiful panorama of the Western mountains. So I love that office, and that was where I worked every day. I think there's a couple other pictures that I sent you too that you could show.
We're getting there. We go.
Okay.
This is my favorite. I love this.
Completely ruined and spoiled me. I'm in my 20s flying private aircraft all over with President Reagan. So very special. My life does not involve private aircraft at the moment. So unfortunately, I fly coach like everybody else, but just really amazing moments to be able to fly into cities with him and watch the warm welcome that he got every place that he went. Here I'm at my desk. You can, it's a foggy, smoggy California day, but we had a beautiful view of the Pacific Ocean out in the distance. And there I am, probably sending off photos or something to somebody with my very old school computer, printer, fax machine, typewriter, all the things.
I remember those days. Oh, this is a great one. I love it.
We would celebrate, of course, President Reagan's birthday in the office every year. And so here I am holding his 82nd birthday cake as he's blowing out the candles. And how fun to have a front row seat to so many special moments in his post-presidency years. Here we are on the rooftop of Fox Plaza. So if you've ever seen the movie Die Hard, this is Nakatomi Towers, which was the Fox Plaza building. We had the entire 34th floor, which was the top floor of that building. In fact, the scene where Bruce Willis is hiding in the bathroom and he's all bloodied, that actually took place in President Reagan's private bathroom before the building was even completed. We watched the movie in the office with President Reagan, and he kind of joked and looked around and he said, well, they did a pretty good job putting this building back together, because in the movie it gets blown up and shot up and all these things. But here we are on the roof of the building, and every now and then on a clear day, he would take these military grade binoculars he had been given and say, do you think we could go up to the roof and look around? And so you could see forever from there. He could pick out his house between the trees. He could see the golf course where he played, of course, the Pacific Oceans, the planes landing at Santa Monica Airport. This was a man who had spent so many decades in LA that it was fun to hear him tell his stories, point out all of the landmarks in LA, and just enjoy getting some fresh air. But I do write in my book, as Jennifer knows, about how even just getting him from the 34th floor to the rooftop of the building took quite a bit of finagling to make that happen. One of many pictures that I have with my kids with President Reagan. Here we are at a polo match. Ronald Reagan was a horseman, so he loved watching the horses run and play polo. And here I'm with my daughter Courtney at the polo matches with him. And, you know, my kids had so many great memories with the president, out and about like this with him, the Los Angeles Zoo, swimming in his swimming pool, going to his house many times, going places with him. And so my kids, here's my daughter, I think this was Paige, my third of my four, meeting President Reagan, a few days old for the very first time. And they grew up with him. And so how special for them to have those memories of Ronald Reagan. That picture that's hanging on my wall, very faded, is actually the cover photo of my book, which I'll hold up later because I realize I'm just not on screen. But I snapped that picture in his office one day. I walked in and he was seated at his desk, and I said, Mr. President, you look especially handsome today. Do you mind if I take your picture? Well, all right, he says. And I snapped this picture and it just captured him beautifully in those post-presidency years. And so when I was approached about writing my book, I didn't know word one of what was going to be inside, but I knew that I wanted that picture on the cover. And so it is on the cover of The President Will See You Now.
That's a fantastic backstory. I did not know that.
And here's one of many pictures of world leaders. There's former President Gorbachev meeting President Reagan. We're standing in front of a piece of the Berlin Wall. So all these little pieces of history that I never thought I would be fortunate enough to see. I just feel very blessed not only to have witnessed these things firsthand, but to have the ongoing opportunity to be one of many torchbearers for Reagan's life, his leadership, and his legacy.
I do have a quick question. Do you have a piece of the Berlin Wall?
I do.
Like that. That's so cool.
Do. Yeah.
What an amazing piece of history.
Not that big a piece, but I do have a piece.
So I'm going to click out of this because this is just our final slide. And I know some students or even online.
I'll hold up my book. Here's my book.
There we go. There we go.
It does have that picture on the front. And actually that picture on the back of my Lady Diana haircut back in the day.
There's other pictures inside too. So
yeah, there's some fun
pictures. Really other cool
inside.
pictures. So questions. What questions do you guys have? Yes, I see a question up in the back.
So I either have my list of questions you sent that I can do like rapid fire, or I can take questions from people who are there. Either way.
We've got one in the audience.
All
so
right.
I probably have to repeat it for you. But you want to come up and read it into the microphone so that you can hear? I'm not going to torture you all to do that, but it's hard to hear from the back. Yep, right in the
And tell me your name and where you're from.
My name's Colt Wimpy. I'm from Midland, Texas.
Hey, cool.
I've got two questions. First, how did Mr. Reagan take his coffee? And then second, what was it like to work for Mr. Reagan during the rise and subsequent boom of the internet?
Oh, yeah. Good questions. Let's see. Coffee. He wasn't a huge coffee drinker. Usually in the morning and at his desk, he would have a glass of water. He would have iced tea. He liked iced tea. He'd have a cup of coffee in the morning, but he didn't have to have it, but I think he just liked it black, old school black. Before the days of Starbucks and lattes and all those things, we didn't have so many choices. And then your second question, rise of the internet. You know, I actually, and I'm making myself sound like 100 years old, which I'm almost there, but not quite. In my office, as you saw, we had a word processor. And then before I left my time in the office, we actually had a chat feature, which we thought was really great, which was like a network on our floor where we could talk to other people across the office without picking up the phone. So it was like a messaging chat kind of thing for a closed network. While I was working for him at the office, the internet hadn't even really taken flight. I remember our first cell phones in the office were they're kind of like these big military field phones you see now. They're about like this big, and they have the hard antenna out of the top. And we had two of those in the office that you could check out when you were going someplace. So we thought we were really fancy and special and important. But the president, surprisingly, was interested in all of that. Definitely kept up on what was happening. Didn't necessarily engage with a lot of it, but a lot of it was just starting as he was leaving office. But I know that, for instance, like Twitter, he definitely would have been on Twitter because he was a great communicator. He was quippy. He had great one-liners. And so I would have loved to follow him on Twitter. And as much as he at the time was the oldest president to have served, he was always very interested in the next generation. And in fact, he won by a landslide in his second term because so many young people voted for him, even though he at the time was the oldest president. So he always had a great connection to the future, to future thinking, to looking forward, and to young people. So I'm sure he would have embraced technology had it really been available to him at the time.
One of the questions I have on my sheet has to do with President Reagan's sense of humor. And he used humor to diffuse really tense situations, but also to build relationships. Do you have a personal example or an example you want to share with us? Because that's
He
so,
did. Yeah. And it's funny because, a lot of times if he was giving a major address, he usually worked off note cards to just give a speech. And he was very extemporaneous in the way he spoke. And you knew kind of what he was going to cover, but who knows? He would just craft these beautiful speeches. But he usually worked off little half sheet note cards. And so a lot of times we would have those note cards. We knew what he was going to be talking about. He would start going on some big rabbit trail and tell a story or tell a joke or something, and then masterfully come right back to where he had left off and then continue on. And inevitably, that was the most quoted, the most remembered, the most applauded part of the speech. But he knew how to read his audience and he knew what they would respond to. And so he was a master storyteller and did use humor and jokes a lot. Excuse me.
Take a drink, and because you're talking so much, what other questions do
I
we
know, I'm
have?
so sorry, my
wanna
voice
know.
sounds so terrible.
All right, so we have another student coming up. Tyler's coming on up.
Hi, how's it going?
Hi, good. Tell me your name and where you're from.
My name is Tyler and I'm from Frisco, Texas. So I did a little research about yourself, and how did you feel about being featured on Pepperdine's 40 under 40?
Well, Tyler, I don't admit that I'm over 40 because a woman is always 39 and holding, right? So I
Right.
think I was probably a little offended by that. But now that I'm a mother of four and a grandmother of two, I think I probably have to embrace that I'm at least 40. I'm so proud of my alma mater, Pepperdine.
Mhm.
And where you're at school is so important and will be a part of your life story wherever you go. It'll be part of your network, who you connect with, and definitely a great opportunity to amplify whatever business or industry you go into. And so, excuse me, I am very proud of my alma mater and so grateful and honored to be featured by them. There's so many outstanding Pepperdine alums. So to be counted among them, albeit for being the over 40 category, I was very honored.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you, Tyler.
So hi, my name is Mason. I'm from San Antonio, Texas. And on the sheet, the very last question, I know you said President Reagan was very important about the future generations and the younger generations.
Yeah.
How do you think President Reagan would, do you think President Reagan would be happy with how the future of America has turned out?
Interesting question. I usually get asked that from a political lens, but Ronald Reagan always had great faith, belief, optimism in the American people. In fact, he used to say, one of the great things about America is in our founding documents, it starts with we the people, meaning we the people tell the government what to do, not the other way around. And so I know sometimes people look at different political parties or leadership on the global stage or even domestically and say, well, I don't like that person or that party or that policy. But Ronald Reagan had undying belief in the American people. And so I think that as much as we often see the toxicity, the negativity, all the bad in the world, there's so much good. I mean, we even look in this last week, the tragedy of the tornado that blew through Mississippi and Alabama and other places, the beauty of the American people rising up with generosity, not only with money, but with food and water and clothing and rolling up their sleeves and helping strangers and neighbors alike. And so the American people are a beautiful, generous, optimistic, forward-looking, patriotic people. And so we just don't always get a look at those stories, and we don't always highlight those people like we should. And so I think Ronald Reagan would have continued to look for the good and look for the good people who are doing great things still in this country and in the world, rather than following the top line news stories, which don't often highlight that as much.
Right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mason.
Other questions? Come on up. Come on, come on. We've got another student coming in.
All right.
So my name is Jared. I'm from Oahu, Hawaii. Did you
Aloha, Jared.
did you go to Camp David at all, or have any affiliation with them when they were up there at all? Because I know Reagan made that really large, and I was just kind of wondering about that.
Yeah, Hawaii is one of my favorite places. I cannot wait to get back there soon. It never comes soon enough, but every time I go, I say, why do I leave? So you're very lucky to be from there. But so Camp David was where he went as a presidential retreat when he was in office. I served him after he left the White House. And so I went up to his personal ranch, which is Rancho del Cielo up in Santa Barbara, about 2 hours outside of Los Angeles. And I went up there with him many times. And there's some pictures in the book of him driving his Jeep and meeting Gorbachev up there. I was there when he met with Gorbachev and Margaret Thatcher and Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister of Canada, and others. And so it was always really wonderful to see him when he was in his Wrangler jeans and his big belt buckle and his white t-shirt and his boots, working with his horses and chopping wood and doing chores around the ranch. That was where he loved to be. He was quite an outdoorsman, and even though we think of him in a suit in the Oval Office, you should look up the pictures online. He was very fit. He was very active. He worked out all the time, and part of that workout regimen was all the things that he did with horses and keeping up the property up there in Santa Barbara. So I went up there many times with him, and very special. A group called Young America's Foundation owns and runs the property now, and so they do take student groups up there periodically, and they're gracious to let me go up there and bring family and friends sometimes too. And every time I'm up there, I feel him there. He used to call it his cathedral in the sky, and he felt so close to God there. And when I'm there, I not only feel close to God, but definitely feel close to him. I feel him there still.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Anybody else want to come up? So I have a question. One of the items that we included on the agenda based on student questions was you had a front row seat to learning how businesses were run and the government was run. How did that influence you as an entrepreneur and then influence all of your positions later?
Yeah, well, I have worked in the belly of the beast, the behemoth of the federal government for many years. Post-presidency, I was a government employee working for President Reagan. And then as you mentioned in my bio, I worked for the last year of the Trump administration at the Office of Personnel Management, which oversees the personnel guidance for 2.1 million federal employees, as well as I served as the deputy director of the White House Fellows Program. And so as a solo entrepreneur, I'm kind of mean and lean and green and can pivot anywhere, anytime, and do what I want. The wheels of government turn very slowly, and there is a process to everything. There's a process to putting together the process. And so I've seen definitely both extremes of the pendulum. But somewhere in the middle, I think is appropriate. I think it's appropriate for government to move slowly. Their decisions are very consequential and they require proper oversight, both at the agency and department level, obviously congressional level, sometimes the presidential or judicial branches get involved as well. So I think it's important for the wheels of government to turn slowly, but I think there's lots of room for improvement, for innovation, for streamlining, for incorporating the best ideas and best practices from business into government. And that's certainly something that we tried to do during the role that I played at OPM this last administration. And so government always has work that it can do. It can definitely be streamlined. One of the things that we saw during COVID, so many government employees became remote workers. And so that actually opens up a great opportunity now for people all over the nation who aren't in the Beltway of Washington, D.C. to perhaps get some of these wonderful government jobs and to bring new insights and fresh ideas and geographic and experiential diversity to our federal workforce, which is so important. And so I'm hoping that if a lot of these jobs do stay remote, that maybe we can pivot to a broader net being cast instead of just drawing a 20-mile radius around Washington, D.C., and then that's our talent pool for the federal government. So that's maybe a good thing that came out of that. But yeah, I've seen both extremes. I've worked for nonprofits, I've worked for political organizations and campaigns globally. And so I've seen a little bit of everything, the good, the bad, and definitely the ugly as well.
So we're nearing the end of our time, and I know your time is valuable. So just one last, I guess, the last question I would have is, what key leadership communication skills or knowledge would you share with students? What do you share with your own kids?
Yeah, my kids are tired of hearing me. They're so glad you invited me to speak to your class today because they're tired of hearing me. No, I'm just kidding. My kids are incredible and they just have, I think, have absorbed it over the years and also learned directly from the great communicator himself. I never like to put words in Ronald Reagan's mouth, but I do like to use his words often because I think that he always said it best and described it in ways that are so powerful and important. And so I guess I would leave you with one of my favorite quotes of his. He gave it at the 1992 Republican National Convention, which was held in Houston. At the time, we didn't know that this would be one of his last major public addresses. But he says to us these words. He says, "Whatever else history may say about me when I'm gone, may it say that I appealed to your best hopes, not to your fears, and to your confidence rather than your doubts." And when we look at the way people communicate today, especially in the political arena, what do they appeal to? Your doubt, your fear. How can we divide people? How can we make people afraid? Ronald Reagan said that's not the way to do it. The best way to communicate it and the best way to be memorable is to appeal to best hopes and to the confidence of people around you. And so Ronald Reagan did it on a world stage. I do it on a much smaller scale. Each of you will have your own platforms of influence, but I think there's great value into listening to those words and to realizing that the best communicators are those who appeal to our best hopes, to our best dreams, to our vision, to a future that's bright, that's optimistic, rather than appealing to the least, the negative, the toxic, and the worst. And so as you each step forward in your own communications journey, whether you're a professional communicator or just using that as one of the tools in your toolbox as a professional, I encourage you to think of the way that Ronald Reagan did it, because all these years later, we're not talking about him because he's gone. We're talking about him because he lived, and the way he lived and the way he lived his life. And so for all of us to lead, to live, to communicate the way he did, I think will help us, like him, have a lasting legacy.
So I want to say thank you. That was amazing. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. We really appreciate the time you took to share your insights on leadership, communication. entrepreneurship. We covered it all today with lots of memories and
Little
photos.
bit of a grab bag. Well,
Yeah,
thank you, Jennifer, for having me. And if any of your students didn't feel comfortable asking a question or had something that we didn't get to, like I said, there were 1,000 things we could have talked about and we only got through a dozen or so. But if there's something that they want to send to me or ask to me, please have them feel free to do that through you, and I'm happy to get back to them directly.